The Rzhev salient, a bleeding wound on the map of the Soviet-German front in '42. Here, 200 kilometers from Moscow, unfolded one of the most dramatic and little-known pages of the Great Patriotic War, Operation Mars, an offensive that was supposed to wipe out the German bridgehead threatening the capital, but instead turned into a tragedy for hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. Why did this large-scale operation, led by Georgy Zhukov himself, remain in the shadow of the Battle of Stalingrad for decades? On November 25, 1942, when the whole world was watching the epical battle on the Volga, an offensive began in the forests and swamps near Rzhev, about which historians preferred to remain silent. In official Soviet military historiography, the Battle of Rzhev was mentioned in passing, as a secondary episode, a diversionary maneuver. But the truth turned out to be much more complex and bitter. Behind the dry lines of military reports lay a real meat grinder that swallowed the lives of tens of thousands of people and became a symbol of the tragic contradiction between the strategic plans of the command and the reality of a bloody war. The autumn of 1942 marked a turning point in the Great Patriotic War. On the Soviet-German front, a paradoxical situation had developed. Strategic initiatives seemed to hang suspended between the adversaries. German troops, exhausted by the summer offensive, could no longer advance with their former speed, but still held vast territories and key positions. The Red Army, on the contrary, had accumulated sufficient forces for counterattacks, but had not yet gained the superiority that would allow it to dictate terms along the entire front. In this situation, the Rzhev salient, a wedge of German positions pushing into Soviet defenses and menacing Moscow, acquired particular significance. This salient presented an ideal springboard for a potential Wehrmacht offensive on the capital. Here, in an area roughly 100 by 150 kilometers, the German command concentrated a powerful grouping of troops, the core of the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht, under the command of Colonel General Walter Model. The Germans had turned the Rzhev salient into a veritable fortress, a deeply echeloned defense, saturated with pillboxes, bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank ditches. Every village was transformed into a strong point, every height into an artillery position. Over a year of occupation, German engineering units had created a defensive system here that German soldiers considered impregnable. The approaches to Rzhev, Sychevka, and Olenino, key centers of resistance, were especially thoroughly fortified. For the Soviet command, the elimination of this salient became a task of paramount importance. The Rzhev wedge not only posed a threat to Moscow, but also tied up significant forces that could have been used in other directions. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command understood. As long as this German grouping existed, a full-fledged strategic offensive in the western direction was out of the question. However, in the autumn of '42, the attention of the entire world was drawn to another sector of the Soviet-German front, Stalingrad. There, on the banks of the Volga, the fate of the German offensive in southern Russia was being decided. Paulus's 6th Army was bogged down in urban fighting, and the Soviet command was preparing a powerful counterattack, Operation Uranus, designed to encircle and destroy the enemy's Stalingrad grouping. In these circumstances, the offensive near Rzhev acquired additional significance. It was intended to divert the attention and reserves of the German command from Stalingrad, to prevent reinforcements from being transferred from the central sector of the front to the southern one. In fact, the Soviet command planned to deliver two powerful blows simultaneously: Operation Uranus near Stalingrad and Operation Mars in the area of the Rzhev salient. Both operations were developed under the personal leadership of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, who in those days was literally torn between two fronts, coordinating the preparation of the offensives. This is why Operation Mars is sometimes called the Second Stalingrad Offensive. According to the Stavka's plan, it was to be no less significant than the famous encirclement of Paulus's army. The strategic situation in the autumn of 42 demanded decisive action. The Red Army finally had the opportunity to seize the initiative, and this chance could not be missed. Operation Mars was conceived in the tense atmosphere of autumn of 42nd year. Its development was personally overseen by Georgy Zhukov, coordinator of actions simultaneously on two strategic fronts, near Stalingrad and in the Rzhev salient area. The operation's concept was ambitious and large-scale. By forces of the Western and Kalinin fronts, deliver concentric strikes at the base of the Rzhev salient, encircle and destroy the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht, thereby eliminating the enemy's strategic bridgehead threatening Moscow. The main idea was to conduct a classic cauldron, a tactic that Soviet command began to successfully master after the bitter lessons of 41st year. The Western Front, under the command of General Ivan Konev, was to strike from the south, in the direction of Sychevka. The Kalinin Front of General Maxim Purkayev, from the north, in the direction of Olenino. The meeting of the Udarnik groupings was planned in the Rzhev area, which would lead to the complete encirclement of the main forces of the German 9th Army. Enormous forces were allocated for the operation. The total number of troops participating in the offensive was about 800,000 people. The strike groupings included over 2,000 tanks, 10,000 cannons and mortars, significant air forces, about 1,000 aircraft. According to Stavka's plan, such a concentration of forces was to ensure a decisive superiority over the enemy and a quick breakthrough of his defenses. The Soviet command sought to create a 3- to 4-fold superiority in manpower and equipment on the main attack directions. Special hopes were placed on tank formations, which were to develop tactical success into operational. For this, the 6th and 5th Tank Corps, as well as the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, reinforced with tank brigades, were involved. The German grouping in the Rzhev salient numbered about 300,000 people. General Colonel Model had at his disposal up to 600 tanks and assault guns, as well as a significant amount of artillery. However, the main trump card of the Germans was not their numbers, but a deeply echeloned defense, which had been created over many months. Model, nicknamed Master of Defense, managed to turn the Rzhev salient into a real fortress. Preparation for the operation was carried out under the strictest secrecy. Zhukov personally controlled the process of troop concentration, demanding maximum camouflage. Movements were carried out mainly at night. Radio communication was minimized. Stavka sought to achieve tactical surprise, understanding that strategically it was impossible to conceal the preparation of such a large-scale operation. Particular attention was paid to artillery preparation. A powerful fire impact on the enemy's defenses was planned before the start of the offensive. Special assault groups were formed to break through fortified lines, equipped with everything necessary to combat pillboxes and dugouts. The start of the operation was scheduled for November 25th, a week after the start of the counteroffensive near Stalingrad. This choice was not accidental. It was assumed that by this time the German command would have already transferred part of its reserves from the central sector of the front to the south, thereby weakening the defense of the Rzhev salient. However, in reality, this did not happen. By November 1942, for Operation Mars, the Soviet command concentrated an impressive grouping of forces. The Western and Kalinin fronts together numbered about 800,000 men, over 2,000 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and approximately 1,000 aircraft. On the main attack axis, a 3- to 4-fold superiority over the enemy in manpower and equipment was created. The main striking power of the Western Front consisted of the 20th, 31st, and 29th Armies, reinforced by the 6th and 5th Tank Corps. The Kalinin Front deployed the 22nd, 39th, 41st Armies, and the 1st Mechanized Corps. A special role was assigned to General Kryukov's 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, reinforced by tank brigades. It was tasked with developing the breakthrough success and reaching deep into the enemy's rear. The German grouping in the Rzhev salient was represented primarily by formations of the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht, under the command of General Oberst Walter Model. The total number of German troops here was about 300,000 men, 600 tanks and assault guns, and a significant amount of artillery. The core of the defensive grouping consisted of 6 infantry corps, including 22 divisions and 2 tank divisions in reserve. However, a simple comparison of troop numbers does not provide a complete picture of the balance of forces. German units had a significant advantage in the quality of their defense. During a year of holding the Rzhev salient, they had created a deeply echeloned system of fortifications with concrete pillboxes, an extensive network of trenches, anti-tank ditches, and vast minefields. The depth of the defensive system reached 20 kilometers in some places. Every village was turned into a strongpoint, and key heights into powerful resistance nodes. The combat readiness of Soviet troops before the start of the operation was uneven. Units recently replenished after previous battles had a significant number of unseasoned fighters in their ranks. Many tank formations received new equipment, but crews did not always have time to master it fully. The lack of preparation time also played a role. The Soviet command was eager to start the operation to synchronize it with the Stalingrad counteroffensive. The morale of Soviet troops was high. After the victory near Moscow and the first successes near Stalingrad, there was confidence in the possibility of defeating the enemy. However, difficult weather conditions and fatigue from previous battles created additional challenges. The onset of frosts and snowfalls hampered the maneuvering of equipment and the supply of troops. German units, despite the general deterioration of the Wehrmacht's position on the Eastern Front, maintained high combat effectiveness. The soldiers of the 9th Army had rich combat experience and were well adapted to winter conditions after the lessons of the previous winter. Army Commander Walter Model enjoyed well-deserved authority among his subordinates and had a reputation as a master of defensive battles. Operation Mars is inextricably linked with the name of Army General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. It was he whom the Stavka of the Supreme High Command entrusted with coordinating 2 key offensives of the autumn of '42, Uranus near Stalingrad and Mars in the Rzhev salient area. This was unprecedented responsibility, even for a commander of such magnitude. In fact, Zhukov had to simultaneously lead 2 major operations, separated by hundreds of kilometers, under conditions of limited communication and movement capabilities. Zhukov's powers in Operation Mars were extensive, but not limitless. Formally, he acted as a representative of the Stavka, coordinating the actions of the Western and Kalinin fronts. Direct command of the troops was carried out by the front commanders, General Ivan Konyev and General Maxim Porkayev. However, Zhukov's authority and influence were so great that his instructions were perceived as direct orders from the Supreme High Command. Zhukov's command methods during this period reflected both his strengths and weaknesses. On the one hand, an iron will, decisiveness, the ability to concentrate forces in key directions. On the other, excessive rigidity, intolerance of objections, and at times, an insufficient consideration of the actual situation on the ground. Army and Corps commanders recalled that Zhukov demanded the fulfillment of assigned tasks at any cost, accepting no excuses. Interaction with the front commanders was not easy. Relations with Ivan Konyev were particularly difficult, as he had his own vision of the operation and did not always agree with Zhukov's instructions. These contradictions were exacerbated by the fact that Zhukov could not physically be constantly in the Rzhev salient area. His presence was also required near Stalingrad. The psychological pressure on Zhukov during this period was enormous. He understood perfectly well that success at Stalingrad was necessary for a turning point in the war, but failure at Rzhev could also have catastrophic consequences. He had to be torn between 2 fronts, making critically important decisions under conditions of time and information deficit. Stalin expected victory from Zhukov in both directions, and this created additional tension. The commander realized that a second unsuccessful attempt to break through the Rzhev salient would not be forgiven. At the same time, the main reserves of the Stavka were directed to Stalingrad, and for Operation Mars, they had to make do with what was available on site. In his memoirs, Zhukov later mentioned Operation Mars very sparingly, focusing on the successes at Stalingrad. This is not surprising. Acknowledging the scale of the defeat at Rzhev cast a shadow on the reputation of the outstanding commander. However, it is precisely this duality of tasks facing Zhukov in the autumn of 42 that largely explains the tragic outcome of the Rzhev offensive operation. On November 25, 1942, precisely at 7:30 in the morning, the silence of the snow-covered forests and fields of the Rzhev salient was shattered by the roar of Soviet artillery. Operation Mars had begun. The powerful artillery preparation lasted 80 minutes on the Kalinin front sector and 120 minutes on the main attack axis of the Western Front. Thousands of guns and mortars unleashed a barrage of fire on German positions, transforming enemy fortifications into a chaos of earth, concrete, and metal. At 9 o'clock in the morning, as the artillery fire shifted deeper into the defenses, Soviet infantry, supported by tanks, launched their attack. The first day of the offensive yielded mixed results. On the sector of General Kiryukin's 20th Army, they managed to penetrate the German defenses to a depth of up to 3 kilometers. Units of the 41st Army of the Kalinin Front also achieved some success, advancing 2 to 2.5 kilometers. However, it became clear on the very first day that the pace of the offensive was significantly behind schedule. The weather made its own adjustments to the course of the operation. The onset of snowfall sharply limited visibility, and the temperature dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. Soviet aviation was unable to provide effective support to ground troops due to poor meteorological conditions. Tanks struggled to overcome the snow-covered terrain, getting stuck in snowdrifts and becoming easy targets for German anti-tank artillery. The German command quickly recovered from the initial shock. Colonel General Model, who was at the forward command post, personally directed the regrouping of forces and the deployment of reserves to threatened sectors. By the end of the first day of the offensive, it became evident that the element of surprise had been lost, and the enemy was offering organized resistance. On November 26th, the offensive continued. Soviet troops attempted to develop their initial success, but encountered increasingly fierce resistance. Particularly heavy fighting unfolded in the offensive zone of the 20th Army, where the Germans counterattacked with forces from the Grossdeutschland Panzer Division. The 6th Tank Corps, committed to the breakthrough in this direction, lost up to 70 tanks that day and failed to accomplish its assigned mission. On the Kalinin front sector, the situation was no better. The 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, reinforced by tank brigades, attempted to develop the offensive in the direction of Belly, but became bogged down in the forested and swampy terrain, suffering heavy losses from German artillery and aviation fire. By the end of the second day of the operation, it became clear that the initial plan to break through the German defenses and rapidly advance deep into the Rzhev salient was failing. Zhukov, receiving reports from the front, demanded that army commanders intensify the offensive, regardless of losses. However, reality proved harsher than orders. The German defenses, meticulously prepared and deeply echeloned, resisted a quick breach. On November 27th, the offensive continued with even greater ferocity. The Soviet command, realizing the failure of its initial plans, committed new reserves to battle. On the main attack axis of the Western Front, the 5th Tank Corps was introduced, intended to develop the success and reach Sychevka. However, the Germans, using a well-organized anti-tank defense system, met the Soviet tanks with concentrated artillery and anti-tank gunfire. The first 3 days of Operation Mars revealed serious miscalculations in intelligence. It turned out that the German defenses were much stronger than anticipated. Many pillboxes and dugouts, not suppressed by artillery, continued to fire, inflicting heavy losses on the attacking units. The minefields proved to be much more extensive than intelligence data indicated. Sappers were unable to clear passages in time, which slowed the advance of tanks and infantry. The Rzhev salient became a true fortress for the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Over a year of occupation, German engineering units created a defensive system here that German soldiers themselves considered impregnable. The depth of the defense reached 15 to 20 kilometers and included 3 main lines of fortifications, saturated with pillboxes, bunkers, and dugouts. Every settlement was transformed into a strongpoint with all-around defense. Command heights, which controlled approaches to key resistance nodes, were especially meticulously fortified. German sappers created extensive minefields, laying up to 100,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Anti-tank ditches up to 3 meters deep and 6 meters wide blocked possible routes for Soviet armored vehicles. The terrain, already difficult for an offensive due to numerous forests and swamps, was further saturated with artificial obstacles, forest abatis, flooded lowlands, and wire entanglements. Colonel General Model's 9th Army had a well-thought-out fire system that provided multi-layered coverage of all approaches to defensive positions. Artillery was positioned to deliver both frontal and flanking fire on advancing troops. German defensive tactics were based on 2 years of experience in the war on the Eastern Front. Instead of evenly distributing forces along the front, Model created a system of strong points and resistance nodes capable of all-around defense. The gaps between them were covered by crossfire, and if necessary, blocked by mobile reserves. Special attention was paid to combating Soviet tanks. Anti-tank areas, saturated with artillery, including new 75mm anti-tank guns, capable of hitting any Soviet tank, were created in tank-dangerous directions. Tank destroyers were armed with cumulative grenades and anti-tank rifles. German artillery played a key role in repelling Soviet attacks. Pre-sighted lines allowed for accurate fire on concentrations of advancing troops. The system of observation posts ensured operational fire control. Artillery counter-battery groups were ready to suppress Soviet artillery. German tank reserves were relatively small, about 600 tanks and assault guns for the entire Rzhev salient. However, Model used them with maximum effectiveness, keeping them ready to launch counterattacks in threatened directions. Tank groups were typically reinforced with motorized infantry and engineering units, which increased their combat stability. Air support was provided by aircraft of the 8th Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe. Despite the general deterioration of the German Air Force's position on the Eastern Front, significant forces were allocated to cover the Rzhev salient. German fighters successfully countered Soviet ground attack aircraft, and bombers struck concentrations of Soviet troops. A distinctive feature of the German defense was its flexibility and ability to quickly adapt to changing circumstances. Model created an effective command and control system that allowed for the rapid transfer of reserves to threatened sectors. An extensive network of communications, including underground communication cables, ensured stable troop control even in intense combat conditions. The German command paid great attention to reconnaissance, having detailed information about Soviet forces. This allowed for timely identification of the directions of main attacks and the concentration of necessary forces on them. Reconnaissance aircraft and advanced observation posts provided constant control over the actions of Soviet troops. An important element of the defense was the system of engineering obstacles, which created channels to direct advancing Soviet units into pre-prepared fire sacks. This tactic allowed the Germans to compensate for the enemy's numerical superiority and inflict maximum losses with minimal expenditure of their own forces. The effectiveness of the German defense in the Rzhev salient was due not only to the engineering preparation of the terrain and tactical skill, but also to the high morale of the troops. The soldiers of the Ninth Army, hardened in battle, had extensive experience in defensive operations and were confident in their abilities. Walter Model, nicknamed the Fire Brigade Führer, personally inspected defensive positions and inspired the troops with his presence at the front line. The system of German defense in the Rzhev salient became a serious test for Soviet troops who embarked on Operation Mars. By the end of the first week of the offensive, Operation Mars was on the verge of collapse. The initial plan of a swift breakthrough of the German defenses and the encirclement of Model's Ninth Army had devolved into a grueling stalemate, devouring Soviet reserves. Problems with troop command and control manifested fully, severely undermining the effectiveness of the strike groups. The communication system, critically important for coordinating the actions of numerous formations, suffered from constant failures. Radios broke down in the cold, and wired communications were severed by German shelling. Commanders often lacked up-to-date information on the positions of neighboring units, leading to dangerous gaps between advancing units. The Germans skillfully exploited these breaches for counterattacks. The problem of interaction between different branches of service proved particularly acute. Infantry, tanks, and artillery acted disjointedly, failing to provide each other with necessary support. Tank units that broke through often found themselves without infantry cover and became easy prey for German anti-tank guns. Artillery could not always quickly shift fire to identified enemy strongpoints due to communication breakdowns. Zhukov, torn between the Rzhev salient and Stalingrad, could not personally control all aspects of the operation. His demands to continue the offensive at all costs often disregarded the real situation on the ground. Army commanders, fearing the wrath of the Stavka representative, threw troops into frontal assaults on fortified enemy positions, leading to unjustifiably high losses. Weather conditions exacerbated the situation. Heavy snowfalls and frosts hampered troop maneuvering and equipment operation. Soviet T-34s and KVs, technically superior to German tanks, lost their advantage on snow-covered, broken terrain. Aviation remained grounded for most of the time due to unflyable weather. But perhaps the most serious factor undermining the success of the operation was supply problems. Advancing units quickly exhausted their initial stock of ammunition, fuel, and provisions. Organizing uninterrupted supply under conditions of mud, impassable roads, and constant German air raids proved extremely difficult. Artillery, having expended its ammunition in the first days of the offensive, was forced to conserve shells, which sharply reduced the effectiveness of fire support. Tank units suffered from fuel shortages. There were instances where combat-ready vehicles had to be abandoned due to empty tanks. Infantry, advancing in -20-degree temperatures, did not always receive hot food and warm uniforms. A particularly difficult situation developed with the supply of General Kryukov's 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, which had deeply penetrated the German defenses, but found itself practically cut off from the main forces. Attempts to establish air supply for the Corps were largely ineffective due to bad weather and opposition from German aviation. The German command skillfully exploited the problems of the Soviet troops. Model, nicknamed Hitler's Fireman, masterfully maneuvered limited reserves, transferring them to the most threatened sectors. German artillery methodically shelled identified Soviet supply routes, further aggravating their problems. By early December, the pace of the Soviet offensive had catastrophically slowed. Instead of the planned advance of tens of kilometers, units of the Western and Kalinin fronts struggled to overcome hundreds of meters, suffering enormous losses in the process. The superiority in manpower and equipment dwindled daily, and the German defenses became increasingly organized and resilient. Zhukov's attempts to turn the tide by regrouping forces and changing the directions of attacks did not yield the desired result. Troops were exhausted by continuous fighting, reserves were depleted, and supply and command problems only worsened. Operation Mars, conceived as a decisive breakthrough of German defenses, was turning into a protracted positional struggle, in which the advantage lay with the defenders. By early December 1942, it became clear that the initial plan for Operation Mars was failing. Georgy Zhukov, assessing the critical situation, decided on a radical adjustment to the offensive. An emergency meeting with Army and Corps commanders was held in his office at the Forward Command Post. The atmosphere was tense. Many commanders understood that a continuation of frontal assaults would only lead to new, senseless casualties. The first step was a regrouping of forces. Zhukov ordered a temporary halt to the offensive in secondary directions, and the concentration of all available reserves on two main thrusts, in the sector of the 20th Army of the Western Front and at the breakthrough point of the 41st Army of the Kalinin Front. This measure allowed for the creation of a more significant superiority over the enemy in narrow sections of the front. Special attention was paid to artillery support. Additional artillery regiments were urgently redeployed, and ammunition was delivered by air, despite difficult meteorological conditions. The tactics of artillery use were also changed. Instead of a short, albeit powerful preparation, methodical suppression of identified enemy strongholds was now planned. To overcome supply problems, special transport groups were formed, equipped with high-mobility tractors. In particularly difficult road sections, transshipment points were organized where cargo was transferred to horse-drawn carts or carried manually. Aviation, using rare weather windows, dropped the most critical supplies, ammunition, medicine, food, to units that found themselves semi-encircled. A particularly difficult task was the relief of the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps of General Kryukov. A separate plan was developed for this, providing for a concentrated strike by the 39th Army in the direction of the encircled units. At the same time, the Corps itself was to break through to meet the main forces. Zhukov personally oversaw the preparation of the renewed offensive, rigidly demanding from commanders at all levels to ensure maximum secrecy of maneuver. German intelligence was not to discover the regrouping of Soviet troops before the start of the new phase of the operation. An important element of the adjusted plan was the strengthening of anti-tank defenses on the flanks of the strike groups. The experience of the first days of the offensive showed that the Germans actively used tank counterattacks against the flanks of the breakthrough Soviet units. Now, anti-tank reserves were deployed in advance in potential directions of enemy counterattacks. Minefields were laid, and artillery ambushes were prepared. In early December, fresh rifle divisions and tank brigades from the Stavka Reserve arrived in the offensive sector. This allowed for partial compensation for the losses sustained and injected fresh forces into the battle-weary formations. Special attention was paid to the training of assault groups, specifically trained to combat fortified enemy strongholds. However, all these measures could not fully rectify the situation. The German command, having gained a respite during the regrouping of Soviet troops, also did not waste time. Model transferred additional units from relatively quiet sectors of the front, reinforced artillery groups, and created new anti-tank areas. The German defense became even deeper and more saturated with firepower. On December 8th, the renewed offensive began with a powerful artillery preparation. This time, Soviet troops acted more methodically, aiming not so much for a quick breakthrough as for a systematic gnawing through of the German defenses. However, the results were more modest than expected. The Germans, using pre-prepared positions, offered fierce resistance. Advances were measured in hundreds of meters instead of kilometers. Tank battles became one of the most dramatic episodes of Operation Mars. Soviet command pinned great hopes on armored vehicles capable of breaking through German defenses, and developing tactical success into operational. For this purpose, the 6th and 5th Tank Corps were deployed, as well as separate tank brigades attached to rifle units. In the first days of the offensive, Soviet tank crews faced serious difficulties. Deep snow and frosts down to 20 degrees significantly reduced vehicle mobility. T-34s and KVs, technically superior to German tanks, lost their advantage on the snow-covered, broken terrain. German anti-tank defenses proved to be much more powerful than Soviet intelligence had anticipated. The 232nd Tank Brigade under Colonel Sakno was the first to enter battle. Breaking through the first line of German fortifications, the tank crews rushed forward, but soon came under concentrated fire from masked anti-tank guns. In one day, the brigade lost 27 vehicles out of 55. The crews fought heroically. Mechanic driver Karatonov, having lost a track, continued to fire from his immobile tank, destroying 3 German guns before a shell pierced its armor. General Getman's 6th Tank Corps, committed to battle on the second day of the operation, was supposed to develop the success and reach Suchevka. However, instead of the expected breakthrough, the Corps became bogged down in positional battles. The Germans skillfully used anti-tank areas saturated with new 75mm guns capable of piercing the armor of any Soviet tank. In 3 days of fighting, the Corps lost over 100 vehicles, advancing only a few kilometers. German anti-tank tactics were highly effective. Anti-tank guns were echeloned, creating a multi-layered fire system. The first line was usually camouflaged and opened fire from a distance of 600 to 800 meters, hitting advancing tanks in the flank. When Soviet vehicles discovered and suppressed these guns, they came under fire from the second line, located at a distance of 1,000 to 1,200 meters. Mobile tank hunter groups, armed with Panzerfausts and anti-tank grenades, posed a particular danger. Operating from ambushes, they attacked Soviet tanks at close range, hitting them in their most vulnerable spots. One such detachment, commanded by NCO Werner, destroyed 8 T-34s in one day. German tank units also operated effectively, despite the technical superiority of Soviet vehicles. The Grossdeutschland Panzer Division, which included the latest PZ-KPFW-4s with long-barreled 75mm guns, delivered powerful counterattacks on the flanks of the breakthrough Soviet units. German tank crews avoided frontal engagements, preferring maneuver warfare and using terrain features. The 5th Tank Corps, committed to battle in early December, also failed to achieve decisive success. Despite their power and high morale, the tank crews faced supply problems. A shortage of fuel and ammunition forced commanders to conserve resources, which reduced the Corps' striking power. There were cases where technically sound vehicles had to be abandoned due to lack of fuel. The total losses of Soviet armored forces during Operation Mars were catastrophic. According to various estimates, between 800 and 1,200 tanks were lost, almost half of all vehicles participating in the offensive. German losses were significantly smaller, about 150 tanks and assault guns. These figures reflect not only the balance of power, but also a fundamental difference in tactics. Soviet tank units were often used for frontal attacks on fortified positions, leading to unjustifiably high losses. The Germans, however, primarily used their tanks for counterattacks on the flanks of breakthrough groups, where their effectiveness was maximized. The tank battles near Rzhev revealed serious problems in the interaction of various branches of service. Tanks, without proper infantry support, often found themselves defenseless against tank hunter groups. Artillery did not always manage to suppress enemy anti-tank weapons before armored vehicle attacks. The experience of these battles was carefully studied by the Soviet command and taken into account in subsequent operations. By the summer of 1943, the tactics of using tank formations had undergone significant changes, which allowed for a considerable increase in their effectiveness and a reduction in losses. The 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, under the command of Major General Vladimir Viktorovich Kryukov, became one of the main protagonists in the tragedy of Operation Mars. This elite formation, possessing rich combat experience, found itself in a deadly trap from which many were not destined to escape. In late November of '42, the Corps was tasked with breaking through deep into the German defenses in the vicinity of the city of Belly. The cavalrymen, reinforced by tank brigades, were to exploit the success of the initial breakthrough and cut off enemy communications. The plan was audacious: to use the high mobility of cavalry in conjunction with the striking power of tanks for a rapid maneuver. The first days of the offensive brought some success. Having overcome the first line of German defenses, units of the Corps advanced up to 12 kilometers deep. However, problems then began. The wooded and swampy terrain, deep snow, and impassable roads significantly slowed the pace of advance. Tanks struggled to overcome snow-covered areas, and horses were exhausted. The German command quickly assessed the threat. Colonel General Model, a master of defensive operations, immediately organized countermeasures. Strong counterattacks involving tank units were launched on the flanks of the Breakthrough Corps. Simultaneously, German aviation, taking advantage of a temporary clearing in the weather, unleashed a barrage of bombing strikes on the cavalrymen. By the first days of December, the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps was effectively semi-encircled. The narrow corridor connecting it with the main forces was under fire from German artillery. Supplies virtually ceased. Tank crews were running out of fuel, and artillerymen, shells. The cavalrymen conserved every cartridge. Kryukov reported the critical situation to the front headquarters, but received a categorical order in response: "Hold on, help is coming." Indeed, the 39th Army was thrown in to relieve the Corps. However, its offensive developed extremely slowly. The Germans offered fierce resistance. On December 6th, the ring around the Corps fully closed. Communication with the main forces was maintained only by radio, and even that was intermittent. The situation became critical. The cavalrymen and tank crews formed a circular defense, repelling continuous enemy attacks. The heroism of Soviet soldiers in these battles was truly legendary. The commander of the 3rd Squadron, Guards Captain Plekhanov, with his men, held a key height for 3 days, repelling 17 attacks by superior enemy forces. When ammunition ran out, the cavalrymen engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Tank crews of the 24th Tank Brigade, attached to the Corps, having exhausted their fuel, turned their vehicles into stationary firing points. The crew of Lieutenant Savelyev, having run out of shells, rammed a German armored personnel carrier, destroying it at the cost of their own lives. On December 10th, Kryukov decided to break out of the encirclement. Gathering all remaining forces, the cavalrymen and tank crews launched a concentrated strike in a southerly direction, aiming to link up with the advancing units of the 39th Army. The breakthrough was swift and desperate. Tanks led the way, clearing a path for the cavalry. Units of the Corps suffered heavy losses, but the main forces managed to break out of the encirclement. Many wounded, who could not be evacuated, fell into enemy hands. Equipment that could not be moved due to lack of fuel or damage was destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The outcome of this epic was tragic. Of the 20,000 personnel of the Corps, less than 8,000 remained in action. Almost all tanks and most of the artillery were lost. In fact, the elite formation ceased to exist as a combat unit and was withdrawn to the deep rear for reformation. By mid-December 1942, even the most optimistic commanders realized that Operation Mars was failing. The troops of the Western and Kalinin fronts, despite desperate attempts to break through the German defenses, could not achieve their objectives. The advance was measured in kilometers instead of the planned tens of kilometers. Time was working against the Soviet troops, Every day the German command brought in reserves and strengthened defenses. On December 15th, Georgy Zhukov held a meeting with the commanders of fronts and armies. The situation was tense. Reports from the field painted a bleak picture. Troops were exhausted by continuous fighting, reserves were depleted, and losses in personnel and equipment were enormous. The situation was particularly difficult in tank units. Many brigades had lost up to 70% of their vehicles. After a long and difficult discussion, the only possible decision was made: to cease offensive operations and switch to defense. Zhukov, with a heavy heart, reported this to the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. Stalin, who by that time had received encouraging news from Stalingrad, where Operation Uranus was developing successfully, agreed on the need to stop Mars. The directive to cease the offensive was transmitted to the troops on December 16th. A complex and dangerous process of transitioning to defense in direct contact with the enemy began. The most battered units were withdrawn from the front line, their places taken by fresh units. This maneuver required exceptional caution. German intelligence was closely monitoring any movements of Soviet troops. Special attention was paid to the evacuation of the wounded and damaged equipment. Medical battalions worked around the clock. Field hospitals were overcrowded. Seriously wounded were transported to the rear by hospital trains and planes. Repair crews worked tirelessly, restoring damaged tanks and artillery directly on their positions. To cover the withdrawal of the most exhausted units, special rearguard detachments were created. They simulated activity along the entire front, conducted harassing fire on German positions, and staged false regroupings. These measures allowed them to conceal the true intentions of the Soviet command from the enemy and avoid pursuit. The German side, exhausted by 2 weeks of fighting, did not immediately recognize the change in Soviet troop actions. Model, fearing new attacks, maintained a defensive posture and did not dare to launch large counterattacks. This gave the Soviet command valuable time for an organized withdrawal and consolidation on new lines. By December 20th, the front line had stabilized. Soviet troops occupied well-prepared defensive positions, created a system of fire and engineering obstacles. The most important directions were reinforced with anti-tank artillery and reserves. Gradually, the intensity of combat operations decreased to the level of positional warfare. Artillery duels and reconnaissance group actions. The 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, which had suffered heavy losses, was completely withdrawn from combat and sent to the deep rear for refitting. The same happened with the 6th Tank Corps, which had lost most of its vehicles. Their places on the front were taken by rifle units transferred from the Stavka Reserve. The completion of Operation Mars was a bitter lesson for the Soviet command. For the first time, it had to openly admit that the offensive, on which such great hopes had been placed, had ended in failure. In his reports to Moscow, Zhukov did not conceal the scale of the defeat, although he emphasized the heroism of the Soviet troops and the objective difficulties they faced. German propaganda immediately announced its great victory, having repelled the Bolshevik offensive. Goebbels used this success to boost the morale of the German people, who were receiving alarming news of the disaster at Stalingrad during the same days. Walther Model was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and his 9th Army received an honorary designation. To stabilize the front after the completion of active combat operations, the Soviet command undertook a series of measures. A deeply echeloned defense was created, with a developed system of trenches and communication passages. Artillery positions were carefully equipped and camouflaged. Anti-tank areas with concentrations of anti-tank artillery were created in tank-dangerous directions. Special attention was paid to restoring the combat effectiveness of battered units. Reinforcements, equipment, and ammunition were supplied to the troops. Combat training sessions were conducted, during which the errors of past battles were analyzed and new tactical techniques were practiced. By the end of December, the situation on the front had finally stabilized. The Rzhev salient remained in German hands, continuing to threaten Moscow. However, its days were numbered. 2.5 months later, in March 1943, the German command itself would decide to withdraw troops from this bridgehead, fearing encirclement in the changed strategic situation. Operation Mars officially ended on December 20, 1942. It did not achieve its objectives, but played an important role in the overall context of the war, tying up significant enemy forces at a critical moment of the Battle of Stalingrad. The price of this contribution turned out to be exorbitantly high. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers remained lying in the frozen ground near Rzhev. The cost of Operation Mars was monstrous. Soviet troops lost about 100,000 killed, wounded, and missing. This is more than the losses in the Battle of Stalingrad during the same period. In the encirclement of the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps alone, more than 12,000 soldiers and officers perished. Many wounded, who could not be evacuated in time, froze to death in 30-degree frosts in no man's land. Losses in equipment were no less catastrophic. According to various estimates, the Red Army lost between 800 and 1,200 tanks, almost half of all vehicles participating in the offensive. Hundreds of artillery pieces, mortars, and vehicles were destroyed or captured by the enemy. The Air Force lost over 300 aircraft of various types. German losses, though significant, were incomparable to Soviet ones. According to German data, the 9th Army lost about 40,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Equipment losses amounted to approximately 150 tanks and assault guns, 200 artillery pieces, and about 100 aircraft. The demographic damage was particularly severe. Operation Mars claimed the lives of a huge number of career officers, experienced sergeants, and soldiers who had endured the crucible of battles in 1941, 1942. Their experience and combat skills were invaluable, and replacing them with yesterday's school children and hastily trained reservists was impossible. Among the fallen were many talented commanders. Tank Battalion Commander Major Lavrenenko, who had managed to destroy 52 German tanks, died on the first day of the operation. Rifle Regiment Commander Lieutenant Colonel Seragin, wounded 4 times, refused to leave the battlefield and was killed by a direct hit on his command post. The loss of such officers was an irreparable blow to the Army. In addition to direct combat losses, frostbite and diseases caused immense damage. Thousands of soldiers, forced to lie for hours in the snow under enemy fire at temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, suffered severe frostbite of their limbs. Many had to have fingers, hands, and feet amputated. These people remained disabled forever. The material damage from the failed operation was colossal. Thousands of tanks, guns, vehicles, hundreds of aircraft. All this equipment was created with immense difficulty by evacuated factories working at their limit. Each lost tank meant weeks of intense labor by thousands of workers, often teenagers and women, who had replaced the men gone to the front. In terms of the scale of losses, Operation Mars became one of the bloodiest during the entire Great Patriotic War. In fact, it turned into a second Rzhev meat grinder. After the unsuccessful attempts to eliminate the salient in the winter-spring of 1942, for many divisions participating in the offensive, losses amounted to up to 50% of personnel, a level after which units are usually withdrawn for regrouping. Analyzing the reasons for the failure of Operation Mars, military historians identify a complex of interconnected factors, both tactical and strategic. Of paramount importance were serious miscalculations in intelligence. Soviet command significantly underestimated the strength of the German defenses of the Rzhev salient. Intelligence data did not reflect the actual number of bunkers, dugouts, artillery positions, and the depth of minefields. This led to a situation where artillery preparation, despite its power, could not suppress key enemy strongholds. Tanks and infantry, going on the attack, came under a hail of fire from unsuppressed firing points. Particularly serious was the miscalculation in assessing German anti-tank defenses. The number and location of anti-tank guns turned out to be much greater than anticipated, which led to catastrophic losses of armored vehicles. The second critical factor was the overestimation of their own capabilities. Despite numerical superiority, Soviet troops did not possess sufficient experience in breaking through deeply echeloned defenses. Many units had recently been replenished with inexperienced soldiers who lacked skills for operating in difficult winter conditions. Mid-level commanders often lacked experience in managing large formations in offensive operations. These factors led to the inability to develop success even after a successful breakthrough of the first line of defense. The third key factor was the underestimation of the enemy. Walter Model, commander of the 9th German Army, was rightly considered a master of defensive battles. He created a flexible and resilient defense system capable of quickly adapting to changing circumstances. German troops, despite the general deterioration of the Wehrmacht's position on the Eastern Front, maintained high morale and professionalism. They skillfully used terrain, camouflage, and tactical maneuvers to neutralize Soviet superiority in manpower and equipment. Problems with troop coordination became the fourth factor in the failure. Managing large formations during an offensive proved to be an extremely difficult task. Communications were intermittent. Orders arrived late or were distorted. Interaction between different branches of service, infantry, tanks, artillery, aviation, was often disrupted. This led to situations where tanks found themselves without infantry support, and artillery could not quickly shift fire to identified targets. Weather conditions and terrain features played an equally important role. Severe frosts, reaching 25 degrees below zero, deep snow, frequent blizzards. All this created additional difficulties for the advancing troops. Equipment broke down. People suffered from frostbite. Visibility was often limited. The forested and marshy terrain of the Rzhev salient, cut by numerous rivers and ravines, complicated the maneuver of large formations and gave the defending side additional advantages. Significant errors were also made in planning the operation. The preparation time was compressed, which did not allow for a thorough working out of all elements of the upcoming offensive. The pace of advance was planned unrealistically high without considering the specifics of the terrain and weather. The distribution of forces and means did not always correspond to the importance of the directions. In some areas, there was an excessive concentration of troops, which then hindered each other. In others, there were not enough forces to develop success. Separately, it is worth noting the problems with supply. Advancing troops quickly exhausted their initial stock of ammunition, fuel, and provisions. Organizing uninterrupted supply in conditions of thaw, impassable roads, and constant German air raids proved to be extremely difficult. This led to situations where technically sound tanks had to be abandoned due to lack of fuel, and artillery was forced to conserve shells. One cannot fail to mention the role of the High Command. Zhukov, forced to be torn between two major operations, Uranus near Stalingrad and Mars near Rzhev, physically could not pay enough attention to both directions. His rigid leadership style, which demanded the fulfillment of assigned tasks at any cost, led to unjustifiably high losses in Operation Mars. Army commanders, fearing the wrath of the Stavka representative, threw troops into frontal assaults on fortified enemy positions instead of seeking outflanking maneuvers. All these factors combined led to Operation Mars, conceived as a decisive breakthrough of German defenses and the elimination of the Rzhev salient, turning into a bloody battle of attrition in which the advantage was on the side of the defenders. Soviet troops, despite their heroism and self-sacrifice, could not overcome the complex of objective and subjective difficulties, which led to the ultimate failure of the offensive. Operation Mars, despite its strategic failure, played a significant role in the overall course of the Great Patriotic War. Its historical significance is multifaceted and contradictory, like many events of that pivotal period. First and foremost, the offensive near Rzhev fulfilled a crucial strategic objective. It tied down significant forces of Army Group Center. At the critical moment of the Battle of Stalingrad, the German command was unable to transfer reinforcements from the central sector of the front to the south. Model's 9th Army, forced to repel powerful Soviet attacks, found itself pinned to the Rzhev salient. This allowed Operation Uranus near Stalingrad to unfold as planned, ultimately leading to the encirclement and destruction of Paulus's grouping, a turning point of the entire war. Thus, the blood shed near Rzhev was not in vain. It contributed to the overall victory, albeit at the cost of enormous sacrifices. Operation Mars served as a harsh school for Soviet military art. Analysis of its failures allowed valuable lessons to be learned, which were taken into account when planning subsequent offensive operations. The Soviet command realized the need for more thorough reconnaissance, more realistic planning, and better coordination between various branches of service. The experience of unsuccessful tank attacks led to a revision of tactics for employing armored forces, from frontal assaults to more flexible maneuvering, bypassing fortified strongholds. These lessons were successfully applied as early as the summer of 1943 during the Battle of Kursk and subsequent offensive operations. For a long time, the scale of the defeat in Operation Mars was downplayed in Soviet historiography. The official version presented these events as a secondary diversionary operation, designed to aid the offensive near Stalingrad. The enormous losses were explained by the necessity of tying down enemy forces. In the memoirs of military leaders, including Zhukov himself, the Rzhev operation was mentioned in passing, without a detailed analysis of the reasons for failure. This was due not only to an unwillingness to admit mistakes, but also to political considerations. The need to maintain the image of infallibility of the Soviet military leadership. Only in the 1990s, with the opening of archives and the publication of previously classified documents, did historians gain the opportunity to objectively assess the scale and significance of these events. Modern researchers view Operation Mars as a full-fledged strategic offensive, equal in concept to Operation Uranus, and not merely as a diversionary maneuver. This allows for a new perspective on the strategy of the Soviet command in the autumn of 1942, as an attempt to deliver two powerful blows simultaneously, one of which succeeded and the other failed. The tragedy of the Rzhev battle found reflection in popular memory. Alexander Tvardovsky's poem, "I Was Killed Near Rzhev," became one of the most poignant works about the war. Search teams still find the remains of fallen soldiers in the forests and swamps near Rzhev. In 2020, a memorial complex to the Soviet soldier was unveiled there. A 25-meter bronze figure of a warrior, seemingly dissolving into the sky with a flock of cranes. This is a monument to all who gave their lives in the bloody battles near Rzhev. For military art, Operation Mars became an important lesson, showing that numerical superiority alone does not guarantee success against a well-organized defense. It demonstrated the need for careful planning, accounting for all factors, from weather conditions to the psychological state of troops, the importance of flexible tactics, and the ability to quickly adapt to changing circumstances. These lessons are relevant even today, 8 decades after those tragic events. The Battle of Rzhev reminds us of the price of victory in the Great Patriotic War, a price measured not only by military successes, but also by the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, each of whom had their own story, their own hopes and dreams. Their sacrifice must not be forgotten, just as the lessons of that war must not be forgotten. Lessons of courage, resilience, and self-sacrifice, but also lessons of the cost of mistakes and miscalculations. In this, perhaps, lies the main historical significance of Operation Mars, as a reminder that behind every strategic decision, behind every line on a staff map, stand human lives, and this responsibility cannot be underestimated.